There is a particular kind of Hollywood story that never quite makes the front page, not because nothing happened, but because the person at the center of it was too proud, too private, and too determined to let anyone see the seams come apart. Carolyn Jones was one of the most striking presences in 1950s and 1960s American film and television. She received an Academy Award nomination. She won a Golden Globe. She played one of the most iconic roles in early television history. And then, across a span of years that nobody was fully watching, she lived through a first marriage that barely lasted a year, a second that consumed a decade before quietly falling apart, a third that cost her career and nearly cost her her sense of self, and a final chapter that most people found out about too late. She kept the hardest parts of all of it almost entirely to herself. This is the story behind the glamour. Part 1. Amarillo to Pasadena. The making of an actress. Carolyn Sue Jones was born on April 28, 1930, in Amarillo, Texas, to a family that was already carrying its share of difficulty. Her father, Julius Jones, worked as a barber. Her mother, Chloe Jeanette Southern, was a housewife managing a household with two young daughters. The family might have held together under ordinary circumstances, but Julius Jones was not someone who stayed. When Carolyn was 4 years old, in 1934, he left. He simply walked out, and the life the family had been building in Amarillo collapsed around the two girls and their mother. Carolyn and her younger sister, Bet, moved with their mother into the home of their maternal grandparents, Charles and his wife, on the other side of Amarillo. It was a stable enough arrangement. Charles Baker was a steady, generous man who would play an important role in Carolyn's future. But the abandonment by her father left a mark that Carolyn carried for the rest of her life. She became, by all the accounts that survive from people who knew her in childhood, a loner. She cultivated very few close friendships and spent a significant amount of her time inside her own imagination. Carolyn also suffered from severe asthma throughout her childhood, a condition that frequently kept her housebound when her classmates were out. On the days when the asthma was bad enough to keep her away from the movie theater, which was her primary refuge and the center of her imaginative life, she read every Hollywood fan magazine she could get her hands on. She memorized the names of studios and directors, the trajectories of careers, the mechanics of how an unknown girl became a known one. She was gathering information about a world she intended to enter, even before she had any clear idea of how to do it. She was 6 years old when she decided she wanted to be an actress. It was not a passing phase. It was a conviction that organized the rest of her childhood. In 1947, at 17 years old, Carolyn Jones left Amarillo for California. Her grandfather, Charles Baker, agreed to pay her tuition at the Pasadena Playhouse, one of the most respected acting schools in the country, which had produced a remarkable number of working Hollywood actors. Carolyn had reportedly given a false birth date to gain entry, claiming she was 18 when she was still 17. She was determined enough to lie her way through the door if that was what it took. She threw herself into the Playhouse's program, acting, voice, dance, with the focused intensity of someone who had been waiting for this specific opportunity for years. People who worked with her there described her as a fast study, someone who could memorize dialogue quickly and inhabit a character with a naturalness that wasn't something you could teach. She worked in summer stock during school breaks, both to earn money and to accumulate the experience that would matter when the professional world started paying attention. She graduated in 1950. Before Hollywood got to her, though, she made one personal decision that would be over almost before it began. While still a student at the Pasadena Playhouse, Carolyn Jones married a fellow student named Don Donaldson. He was 28 years old, a former Air Corps officer from Detroit. She was around 20. The marriage was quiet. There was no public announcement, no fanfare, and it ended almost as quickly as it had begun. By 1951, the marriage had dissolved, and Carolyn was on her own again. Almost nothing about this marriage made it into the public record during her lifetime. Carolyn rarely mentioned it, and the brief union with Donaldson has been overlooked or omitted in most accounts of her life that appeared in the press while she was still working. What it suggests, in the context of everything that came later, is a pattern that would repeat itself. A woman whose emotional life moved quickly and whose heart was capable of attaching fully to someone before the full picture of that person had time to develop. The divorce from Donaldson left her unattached and focused on what mattered most to her, building a film career from the ground up in a city that was full of people trying to do exactly the same thing. What happened next was the kind of break that aspiring actors dream about: a talent scout, a screen test, a contract with one of the biggest studios in Hollywood. But the path from that first break to the career she actually wanted was longer and harder than anyone standing in that moment would have guessed. Part 2. Paramount, Early Roles, and the Beginning of Something Real. After graduating from the Pasadena Playhouse in 1950, Carolyn worked as an understudy at the Players Ring Theatre in Hollywood. She stepped into the lead role one night when the actress above her left the production to get married. A talent scout from Paramount Pictures was in the audience that night. He arranged for a screen test, and the screen test went well enough that Paramount signed her to a 6-month contract. She made her film debut in The Turning Point in 1952, an uncredited role, but a beginning. She followed it with a small part in The Big Heat in 1953, again uncredited. Then came House of Wax, the second major 3D film ever produced, starring Vincent Price. Carolyn played a young woman whose character ends up as a wax figure. It was a vivid, visible role in a film that audiences were lining up around the block to see, partly because the 3D technology was still genuinely startling to people experiencing it for the first time. The film became a hit, and Carolyn's face was suddenly connected, in however a small way, to something that people were actually talking about. And then Paramount let her contract lapse. The studio was pulling back on expenses across the board as television began pulling audiences away from movie theaters, and Carolyn Jones was among the casualties of that contraction. She was not devastated. She was practical enough to understand that the first contract was never going to be the whole story. But she was back to building from scratch. In 1953, Carolyn Jones came within arm's reach of one of the most career-defining roles in Hollywood that decade. She was cast in From Here to Eternity, the adaptation of James Jones's novel about the lives of American soldiers and the women around them in Hawaii just before the attack on Pearl Harbor. The film was a prestige production with a heavyweight cast, and the role she had been given, Alma Burke, a hostess at a club on the island, was exactly the kind of part that could have launched her into a different tier of Hollywood visibility. She never made it to the set. A bout with pneumonia struck before filming began and was severe enough that she had to withdraw from the production entirely. The role went to Donna Reed, who gave a performance that won her the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress at the 1954 ceremony. Carolyn watched Donna Reed collect that Oscar and understood, with complete clarity, what she had lost. The pneumonia had not just cost her a role, it had cost her a trajectory. She was not someone who dwelt in self-pity. People who knew her consistently described her as determined rather than defeated. But the From Here to Eternity loss was a wound that stayed tender for years. While Carolyn was navigating this early stretch of her career, the small roles, the big near miss, the daily grind of building a reputation in a city full of people trying to do the same, She met someone who was living a parallel story from a different angle. Aaron Spelling was from Dallas, Texas, which made him, like Carolyn, a Texan who had come to Hollywood with ambition and very little else. He was trying to make his way as a writer, selling scripts wherever he could find a buyer, working as an actor in the meantime to pay for the life he was attempting to build. He was charming, funny, energetic, and, crucially for Carolyn, genuinely interested in the entertainment world in the same way she was. They were both hungry for it. They both found it endlessly absorbing. They could talk about it for hours. They clicked. The connection was real, and it developed fast. Carolyn was the one who pushed toward commitment. She proposed to Aaron rather than waiting for him to ask, which was unusual enough for a woman in 1953 that people who knew about it remembered it for decades. Aaron said yes. They married in April 1953. Carolyn converted to Judaism as part of the union. She was 22 or 23. He was 29. What they were building together in those early years felt like a partnership between two people who were both trying to make the same dream work in their own separate lanes. For several years, that partnership held. But the careers that had once been roughly level began to diverge in ways that put pressure on everything they had built. And the pressure, once it started building, didn't stop. Part 3. Awards, stardom, and the marriage that couldn't hold. The second half of the 1950s was the period during which Carolyn Jones arrived, in a professional sense, at the place she had been aiming for since she was 6 years old, in Amarillo reading fan magazines. In 1956, she appeared in 2 films that drew genuine attention. Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the science fiction classic that remains in continuous circulation to this day, and Alfred Hitchcock's The Man Who Knew Too Much, starring James Stewart and Doris Day. Neither was a leading role, but both were visible, and both gave her the kind of screen time that allowed people to actually register her presence. Then came The Bachelor Party in 1957, and everything changed. The film, adapted from a Paddy Chayefsky television play, followed a group of men on an extended night out in New York City before one of their number gets married. Carolyn played a young woman they encounter, someone rootless and searching, with a melancholy quality that Carolyn made genuinely moving. She dyed her hair black for the role and cut it short, a decision that transformed not just her appearance for that film, but her entire public image going forward. The dark hair became her signature. She was on screen for approximately 8 minutes, and the performance was so fully realized, so specific and true, that she received a nomination for the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress. She lost the award. The winner was Miyoshi Umeki for Sayonara. But she won the Golden Globe for New Star of the Year, and she won the Laurel Award for Top Supporting Female Performance. She was 37 years old in screen terms, but still only in her mid-20s in actual life, and the world was suddenly paying attention in a way it hadn't before. 1958 brought King Creole, the Elvis Presley film set in New Orleans, that most people who study Presley's film work consider his best performance. Carolyn played a complicated, morally ambiguous woman opposite Presley's young musician, and she held her own completely against a co-star who had a level of public fascination around him that was close to unprecedented at the time. She was not overwhelmed by the spectacle of the production. She found the character and stayed in her. Then came Career in 1959, an adaptation of a Broadway play about the compromises and costs of trying to make it in show business. Carolyn gave what many people who have studied her work consider her finest performance, nuanced, restrained, and fully inhabited. The film was not a commercial success, which meant the performance reached a relatively small audience, but the people who saw it knew what they were watching. By the early 1960s, Carolyn Jones had established herself as an actress of real range, someone who could do drama, comedy, and the complicated space between them with equal conviction. She was not a conventional leading lady, which Hollywood's machinery made difficult to navigate, but she was something arguably more interesting, an actress you couldn't take your eyes off. Aaron Spelling's career, meanwhile, had found its own direction. He had made the transition from struggling actor to television writer, selling his first script to The Jane Wyman Show in 1956, and the transition turned out to suit him perfectly. He was prolific, he was commercially instinctive, and the television industry in the late 1950s and early 1960s was expanding rapidly in ways that rewarded exactly his kind of talent. As Aaron's career surged, the balance inside the marriage shifted. The two people who had once been roughly equal in ambition and roughly similar in struggle were no longer occupying the same terrain. Aaron was building an empire in television. Carolyn was still navigating the complicated politics of a film career that had not yet settled into the kind of reliable leading lady position she had imagined. The imbalance created friction. Two people who are both deeply invested in a competitive industry and who were once equals do not always navigate the experience of one pulling significantly ahead of the other with grace. The marriage began to fray. Aaron began keeping late hours with no clear accounting for where he was or what he was doing. The explanations became less convincing. The trust that had held the early years together began to erode. They separated in October 1963. The divorce was finalized in August 1964. The split was, by the accounts of people close to both of them, handled with more dignity than many Hollywood divorces of the era. They divided community property, reportedly around $400,000, and Aaron gave Carolyn the house. She did not ask for alimony. They agreed to remain civil, and they managed it. In later years, Carolyn would appear in several productions that Aaron produced, which was a testament to the fact that the end of the marriage had not poisoned everything that had come before it. But Carolyn was 33 years old when the marriage ended, and everything that she had built, the career momentum, the public profile, the partnership with a man who was rapidly becoming one of the most powerful figures in television, suddenly had a gap in it where the second half was supposed to be. Then, in 1964, something arrived that appeared to solve the problem. The role that was about to come her way was one that would define her public image for the rest of her life. It would also, in ways nobody predicted at the time, set up the conditions for the most damaging chapter her personal life would ever produce. Part 4. Morticia, Typecasting, and the Second Marriage That Cost Everything. The Addams Family premiered on ABC on September 18, 1964, and Carolyn Jones's Morticia Addams became, almost immediately, something rare in early television. A character so specific and so perfectly realized that the actress playing her and the role itself became essentially inseparable in the public mind. Morticia was macabre, elegant, loving, and gently absurd. She adored her husband, doted on her peculiar children, and moved through the family's cobwebbed mansion with a serene authority that suggested a woman who had absolutely no idea that the world found her unusual. Carolyn inhabited her with a physical commitment that was striking: the floor-length black dress, the slow glide of her movement, the arch of an eyebrow that communicated entire paragraphs. She was funny without mugging. She was strange without being unpleasant. She was the kind of character that looked effortless and required everything. Charles Addams, the cartoonist whose New Yorker drawings had created the Addams family characters in the first place, had personally wanted Carolyn Jones for the role. The two became friends during the production, which Carolyn counted among the genuine pleasures of the entire experience. The show ran for 2 seasons, 64 episodes, before ABC cancelled it in 1966. The cancellation, despite the show's continuing popularity with audiences, was a decision that the network made for reasons related to its broader programming strategy rather than ratings. Carolyn later described the cancellation as one of the more disorienting professional experiences of her life, not because she hadn't expected television shows to end, but because the ending had come before she had earned enough from the role to give herself real financial cushion, and before the cultural moment around the show had fully passed. What followed the cancellation of the Addams Family was the experience that a great many actors describe as one of the most demoralizing in the profession, being so completely identified with a single role that other producers and directors could no longer see past it to the range underneath. Carolyn Jones was Morticia Addams. She had been, before that, an Oscar-nominated character actress with a body of work that demonstrated considerable range. After 1966, the film and television industry largely stopped being able to see the range. Auditions that might have led to complex dramatic roles went to other women. The world that had been opening in the late 1950s had closed back around a single silhouette. She returned to the theatre, working in touring productions and road shows. It was not a retreat. She loved stage work, and she was good at it. But it represented a significant step back from the visibility and the earning power that a sustained television or film career would have provided. She was working. But she was not working in the way that her talent and her ambitions had pointed toward. It was during this period, working on the road, increasingly uncertain about where her career was heading, and freshly out of a marriage that had been one of the organizing structures of her adult life, that she turned to someone she trusted. Carolyn Jones had known Herbert Green in a professional capacity. He was a Broadway conductor and musical director of some standing, and he had served at various points as her vocal coach. They were friendly. He was someone whose company she enjoyed and whose professional opinion she respected. As Carolyn navigated the difficult years following the cancellation of the Addams Family, the touring productions, the increasingly sparse opportunities, the sense that her moment in the industry's full attention had passed, she and Herbert grew closer. What had been a professional friendship deepened into something she understood as love. They married on December 19th, 1968. Carolyn was 38 years old. People who knew Carolyn during this period, and who later spoke about Herbert Green, consistently described him in terms that made the people around her uncomfortable. He was not an easy personality. Those who encountered him found him unusual in ways that went beyond eccentricity, and several of Carolyn's friends were quietly troubled by the match from the beginning. What happened inside the marriage was something that only became fully clear later, in retrospect. Herbert Green made it apparent, relatively early in the marriage, that he expected Carolyn to stop acting, not to scale back, not to be more selective, but to stop. He persuaded her to move with him to Palm Springs, away from Los Angeles, away from the industry, away from the agents and casting directors and producers who would have needed to be cultivated if her career was going to revive. Palm Springs is a resort community in the California desert, about 100 miles east of Los Angeles. It was and is a beautiful place to spend time. Warm, quiet, far from the noise of the city. For a period of rest, it might have been restorative. As a permanent relocation for someone whose entire identity was built around performing, whose sense of purpose and self-worth was inseparable from the work she did in front of an audience or a camera, it was something closer to a slow erasure. Carolyn spent 7 years in Palm Springs with Herbert Green. She was not entirely idle. She worked on a novel during this period, and she appeared in occasional productions when the opportunity arose and Herbert permitted it. But the sustained career she had spent her entire adult life building was simply gone. The connections that she had maintained with great effort over 2 decades in a notoriously fickle industry dried up when she was no longer present to tend them. The phone stopped ringing. The opportunities went to women who were in the room. People who knew Carolyn from her Hollywood years and who saw her during the Palm Springs period described something that was difficult to watch: a woman of tremendous vitality and professional passion who had been somehow talked out of both. She was quieter than she had been. She was less certain. The quality that people had always associated with Carolyn Jones, a kind of electric aliveness, an engagement with everything around her, was diminished in ways that her friends found genuinely worrying. She stayed for 7 years. What finally moved her to leave, in the accounts of people who knew her well, was something simple and undeniable. She missed her life. Not the fame, necessarily, or the glamour, but the work itself. The thing that had pulled her from Amarillo to California at 17, that had kept her going through the lost contract and the lost Oscar role, and the failed first marriage and the collapse of the second. She needed to act. And Herbert Green had convinced her, for 7 years, that she didn't. In April 1977, Carolyn Jones divorced Herbert Green and returned to Hollywood. She was 46 years old. The industry she was returning to had changed. The roles she might have played a decade earlier had gone to younger women, and she was returning with a gap in her resume that would require explaining to everyone who asked. What she did with those conditions was something that surprised almost everyone who had written her off. Part 5. The Return, the Illness, and the Last Marriage. The Hollywood that Carolyn Jones returned to in 1977 was not the same industry she had left. The studio system that had defined the landscape of her early career was long gone. Television had changed shape entirely. The networks were producing different kinds of shows for different audiences, with different rhythms. The faces that occupied the industry's attention were mostly younger, and the gap in Carolyn's working resume, 7 years of near absence while she had been in Palm Springs, was something that casting directors and producers noticed. She was also 46 years old. Hollywood has always been a complicated place for women of any age, and the industry's appetite for women in their 40s was not, in 1977, particularly generous. The parts that come to actresses in that chapter of a career are generally smaller, more peripheral, and offered with less ceremony than what comes before. Carolyn took the parts that were offered and made them count. She appeared in the landmark miniseries Roots in 1977, which reached one of the largest television audiences in American history and reminded anyone who had forgotten that Carolyn Jones could hold the screen with complete authority. She appeared on Fantasy Island. She appeared on The Love Boat. Both shows were produced by Aaron Spelling, a fact that said something interesting about the nature of the relationship they had maintained since their divorce 13 years earlier. He had not forgotten what she was capable of, and when the opportunity to use her arose, he used her. She worked consistently through the late 1970s and into the early 1980s in guest roles, television movies, and stage productions. It was not the career at the center of the industry's attention that she had wanted, but it was a real career, the kind that required skill and reliability and the willingness to show up and do the work without any guarantee of what came next. In March 1981, Carolyn Jones was diagnosed with colon cancer. She was 50 years old. She told almost nobody. Her sister Bet knew. A small number of people closest to her knew. To the wider world, to the industry, to the press, to the people she worked with professionally. She said she was dealing with ulcers. It was a deliberate and considered decision to keep the diagnosis private, and she maintained that privacy with the same composure she had brought to keeping difficult things out of public view her entire life. In the same year she received the diagnosis, she began work on Capital, a new CBS daytime soap opera that was launching in 1982. She had been cast as Myrna Clegg, the scheming matriarch at the center of the show's central family, a role that required her to be commanding, sharp, and present in every scene she was in. She described Myrna with obvious relish as one of the great dramatic villains she had ever encountered on the page. She loved the role. She took it knowing she was terminally ill. She took it and gave it everything she had. It was during her return to stage work in the years following the divorce from Herbert Green that Carolyn met Peter Bailey Britton, a British actor. By the accounts of people who observed them together, the relationship was a genuine and mutual one, warmer and more reciprocal than anything she had lived through with Herbert Green. They had been together for approximately 5 years before they married. On September 25, 1982, Carolyn Jones and Peter Bailey Britton were married. She was 52 years old. She had been diagnosed with terminal cancer for more than a year. She knew what the prognosis was. She married him anyway, not as an act of denial, but as a choice to claim whatever fullness of life was still available to her. People who knew her in those final months described a woman who had not surrendered her personality or her humor or her engagement with the world, even as the cancer advanced. She continued working on Capital as long as she physically could. She continued showing up. She was eventually confined to a wheelchair, and she continued. A co-star on the show, Jane Daly, later described the experience of watching Carolyn work in those final months as something close to witnessing an act of will that most people simply don't possess. Carolyn Jones had kept the cancer secret from the cast of Capital for as long as possible. When it became impossible to maintain the fiction, the people around her responded with the kind of respect that her determination had earned. The show worked around her. They found ways to keep her in scenes, even as her mobility declined. She was, in her own words, going to keep playing Myrna Clegg until she literally couldn't get the words out of her mouth. In July 1983, Carolyn Jones slipped into a coma. On August 3, 1983, she died at her home in West Hollywood, California. She was 53 years old. She had spent the preceding months in a condition that required remarkable effort simply to maintain her presence on a working television set. The cast and crew of Capital, who had come to understand only gradually the full extent of what she was dealing with, watched her during those final weeks of production with a mixture of professional admiration and personal grief. She had given them everything she had until there was nothing left to give. She was buried at Melrose Abbey Memorial Park Cemetery in Anaheim, California, beside her mother, who had died 4 years earlier. Her sister Bet, who had been with her through the entirety of her life, from the house in Amarillo after their father left to the hospital rooms of her final weeks, was there. The legacy Carolyn had said she wanted to leave was a simple and clear one. She had told her sister what she wanted her epitaph to say, that she gave joy to the world. It is carved on her memorial, and it is the right thing to have put there. Part 6. What the Life Tells Us. Carolyn Jones was married 4 times. The first marriage, to Don Donaldson, was brief and left almost no trace in the public record. A young woman's early attachment that dissolved before either person had fully formed into who they were going to become. The second marriage, to Aaron Spelling, was the longest and in many ways the most equal. 2 ambitious people who were genuinely compatible in temperament, who supported each other through the difficult early years, and who ultimately could not survive the different velocities of their professional lives. The divorce was sad, rather than ugly, and the friendship that followed it was real. Aaron Spelling did not forget Carolyn Jones, and Carolyn did not write off what they had been to each other. The third marriage, to Herbert Green, was the one that damaged her most. It did not damage her in the dramatic, visible way that makes headlines. It damaged her slowly, over 7 years, by removing the thing that most defined her and gave her life its particular shape: the work. The isolation in Palm Springs was not simply physical. It was a kind of professional and psychological diminishment that took years to undo, and some of what it took was never fully recovered. The fourth marriage, to Peter Bailey Britton, was by every account the most peaceful and mutual. That she chose to formalize it in the final year of her life, knowing the cancer was terminal, says something important about who she was. Not someone who surrendered to circumstances, but someone who kept reaching for the fullest possible version of whatever was still available. The colon cancer that Carolyn Jones kept secret for the last 2 years of her life was not the first thing she had kept hidden. Her whole professional life had been an exercise in not letting the difficult parts show. The failed early marriage, the lost Oscar role, the typecasting that had followed the role that made her famous, the years in Palm Springs when the career went quiet and the spirit went quieter. She had a performer's instinct for the version of herself that she wanted the audience to see, and she applied it not just on screen, but in life. The price of that instinct is that the people who only knew the surface version of Carolyn Jones, the one in the magazines, the one on the screen, had very little idea of what was happening underneath. What was happening underneath was a woman who had paid very significant costs for the life she lived, who had made choices that didn't always serve her well, who had been shaped by an industry that demanded everything and often returned less than it took, and who had found, in the final chapter of her life, a measure of peace that the preceding chapters had not always offered. Carolyn Jones is remembered primarily as Morticia Addams, which is both appropriate and reductive. It is appropriate because the performance was genuinely brilliant, a fully realized comic creation that holds up across the decades, with a freshness that television performances of that era often do not. The character has been revisited and reinterpreted in subsequent decades by other actresses in other productions, and the shadow of Carolyn's original version falls across all of them. She established the template so completely that it became the definition of the role rather than simply one version of it. It is reductive because there was so much more. The bachelor party performance that earned her an Oscar nomination for only 8 minutes of screen time, a fact that still astonishes people who encounter it for the first time. The work with Hitchcock, the work opposite Elvis Presley, in what most film historians consider his finest screen performance. The dramatic range that career demonstrated before anyone was willing to give a woman who looked like Carolyn Jones credit for having it. She was not a one-note actress. She was not simply a beauty or a presence. She was someone who understood the interior of a character and who communicated that interior with an economy and a truthfulness that the camera caught every time. She was, in the end, an actress of the first order who worked in a system that didn't always know what to do with her. She navigated that system across 3 decades with more grace and more determination than the system deserved. And when the life that system had given her ran out, she used every last hour of it as fully as she could. She gave joy to the world. She said so herself, and she was right. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.